The Injured Senior Podcast is here to help. Like it or not, the senior and elderly population is vulnerable to negligence committed by medical professionals, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, pharmaceutical and medical device companies, insurance companies, and everyday individuals and businesses. Your host, Steve Heisler, creator of the National Injured Senior Law Center, has been advocating for seniors' rights for over 30 years and is bringing you answers to your questions. This is the Injured Senior Podcast.
Good day to all in our injured senior and elderly community. This is Steve Heisler, founder and CEO of the National Injured Senior Law Center, and you are listening to the latest edition of the Injured Senior Podcast. For those of you new to our podcast, the Injured Senior Podcast is a show dedicated to discussing medical and legal issues of vital importance to the injured senior and elderly population, their families, their loved ones, and their caregivers. We are sponsored by the National Injured Senior Law Center, the advocates for the injured senior and elderly community. Injuries to seniors and the elderly can be devastating and rob them of their life savings. If you believe your injury was caused by no fault of your own, go to www.injuredseniorhotline.com or call 877-228-4878 to get some advice. They can help. So today, my friends, we have as our guest Marcia Moran. She is the author of the book, Stroke Forward, How to Become Your Own Healthcare Advocate, One Step at a Time. Now, Marcia was living her life very successfully. She had a very successful business, marriage. She was living life to the fullest. Then on March 30th, 2014, her life changed forever when she suffered a catastrophic stroke. She survived, and she's here today to talk about her life-threatening experience and how she is now helping stroke survivors and their caregivers to move forward during their journeys to recovery. She's also here to discuss how to become your own healthcare advocate when faced with a health crisis. Hello, Marcia. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I cannot complain. We've talked off air several times, and I know that you have a house up in Deep Creek, Maryland, which is up in the mountains for all those who are not familiar with the state of Maryland. When was the last time you were there? Was it during this recent snowstorm?
Yes, when I left there was 2 feet of snow, so it was pretty tricky getting out.
Yeah, you need your own snowplow just to get out. Well, I want to thank you for coming on today.
It's my pleasure.
Get right in. I want to get right into the show. So let's talk about the catastrophic stroke that happened in 2014. Can you tell our listeners what happened?
Yes, so when I woke up that morning, I felt off. And I didn't know what was wrong, but I knew I wasn't going to make breakfast. So I texted my friend Rochelle to tell her that I wouldn't make breakfast. And I looked at my phone and I couldn't read it. I thought, that's weird. So I'll text her later, I said. I put the phone down, I rolled over, and bam, the most excruciating headache hit. And despite the pain, I fell asleep. And the next time I woke up, I knew I was in serious trouble because the whole right side of my body was limp, didn't move. So I rolled myself out of bed and dragged myself along the carpet using my hand digging into the carpet. And I made it to the door, which was closed, and I don't know how many times I struggled to open the door, but I finally got it. I took a rest because I was so tired. And I finally dragged myself down the hallway and ran out of gas. And
is that when Jim, I think your husband Jim, is that when he kind of was alerted?
Well, actually, I don't know what fell, but there was a crash. And he came upstairs to see what was going on, and he found me. And he said, "Marcia, are you okay?" And that's the point I realized I didn't have a voice. That's scary. And he asked me if I could talk, and I couldn't talk, so he called 911. And the first time we heard stroke was the time the paramedics came in, and they saw me, and they said, "When did she have her stroke?" And that was it.
So, had you had any prior symptoms at all, or were you, I guess, a candidate for a stroke?
I'm going to say yes and no. So 2 weeks before I had the stroke, I had been eating popcorn at the movie theater. And we came home and my blood pressure was really high. So we went to the ER and they did nothing. They sent me home. I had taken one of those pills you can take to keep your blood pressure down. And 2 weeks later, I had the stroke. So that could have been a message that I had something going on, but I didn't think about it.
I mean, were you otherwise healthy, though? I mean, were you otherwise in good shape?
Yeah, so I was lean. I ran 3 or 4 times a week. I had normal cholesterol. So it was just a fluke. And actually, I had a carotid artery dissection, which happens 1% to 2% of the time. And what they said was it was a fluke. We had no way of knowing that you were going to have this. So although 80% of strokes are preventable, this one wasn't.
Okay. What kind of stroke did you have? Was it an ischemic or hemorrhagic?
Ischemic.
Okay. And can you explain to our listeners who might not know the difference between the two, a little bit about those two types of strokes?
So, yes, the ischemic stroke is when a blood clot goes up to your brain, and a hemorrhagic stroke is when you have a brain bleed. Ischemic strokes are actually the more common. They happen 87% of the time. So I guess I am one of the lucky ones because I had it and I survived.
I'll say. I mean, I read the book, and we'll get into the book in a moment. Now, one thing I read in the book is that when the paramedics got there, they did not administer TPA.
Right.
And I was still a little confused as to what the advantage is of administering the TPA as opposed to not, and why it was actually to your benefit to not have gotten it.
So TPA is tissue plasminogen activator. And in 2014, they could give it to you if you would have a stroke 3.5 hours beforehand. So when you hit the 3.5 hour point, it was a no-go. Since I had my stroke when I was asleep, they had no way of knowing when I had my stroke, so it was no-go for me. The interesting thing is that if they had given me TPA, I would have a second bleed. And that is what happens when you are out of the zone. So I didn't want TPA, and I'm glad they didn't give it to me.
Yeah, that was a good call on their part.
Yeah.
So what kind of effects did the stroke have on you?
Okay, so initially I was paralyzed on the right-hand side, and I got a slight bit back that night in the hospital. And they actually took me for a walk around the nurse's station. And I say a walk because it wasn't really a walk. It was the nurse holding me up. I couldn't walk really by myself. I was stuck in a wheelchair for a while. The right arm didn't go up all the way. My right leg stuck out when I was trying to walk. I couldn't speak. I was dysphasic, which means I couldn't swallow correctly.
Well, you couldn't swallow, but you also couldn't speak, right? I mean, and that's what
Yeah.
aphasia is.
That's what aphasia is, not being able to speak. Dysphagia is not being able to swallow.
So you have both.
Yes.
This is Steve Heisler. I'm speaking with Marcia Moran, author of Stroke Forward, and you are listening to the Injured Senior Podcast. Now, Marcia, was the aphasia the most difficult part of recovering from the stroke?
I think so. It took a lot longer to recover from aphasia than it did to recover from everything else.
And can you give an example of what you had to do to learn to talk again?
Sure. So I had Broca's aphasia, and that's when I could hear what people were saying, but I couldn't talk back to them. And they tell you to think of words that are similar to what you're thinking if you can't talk, and get them out if you can. So it's like I had two people in my brain. The one that was thinking, oh, this is what I want to say, but I couldn't say it. And then there was another person thinking, okay, what are the words I can think of? And those two things were going on in my mind for 3.5 years. So the first thing I did that worked on aphasia was I went to a chiropractor who did laser therapy. And it was 2 years after my stroke. And he said, I don't know if this will work, but I'll try it on you. And he put the laser up by Broca's area, and that's right in front of my left ear, and suggested I do the cross crawl, which is where you bring your arms and legs up and down. And when it was finished, I left his office, and I noticed that I could speak a little bit better. Yay! And that worked, I'm going to say, about 40 to 50%. And then it stopped working. I didn't get better. So 3.5 years after my stroke, I had another chiropractor suggest I try neurofeedback. And he gave me a link, and he said, you should go study this. So I came home, I studied it, and I went, this is really interesting. So it treats ADHD, strokes, all sorts of things. But the most incredible thing I said was it treated 85% of traumatic brain injury survivors. I'm going, okay, I have to try this, because there's nothing here that says it'll do me wrong. And 85% is a really good indicator. So I went in, I tried it, and it was fantastic. I could speak better that day. After 16 sessions, I could speak like I do now, which I think is a miracle. I don't have the two brains going on anymore. What I think actually comes out of my mouth.
Wow. I mean, that must have been literally life-changing.
It was. It was.
Yeah. I mean, I speak for a living. I'm an attorney. If something like what happened to you happened to me, it's shattered my life. So, yeah. And that was Dr. Fuller that you saw, right?
Yes. Now, you have to understand that the National Aphasia Association says that if you're not cured within the first 2 or 3 months of having aphasia, you will probably have it for life. So this is a big deal.
So you beat the odds.
I beat the odds.
Now, you referred to having a stroke as a traumatic brain injury. Usually one thinks of a traumatic brain injury as maybe a football player that hits his head, or a veteran who there's a blast and I guess, his head is injured. But a stroke is also considered a traumatic brain injury, correct?
Well, the way I see it is a traumatic brain injury is something that happens on the outside, And a stroke is something that happens on the inside, right? But people with both symptoms have similar effect.
Got it. Getting back to the neurofeedback, would you recommend the neurofeedback for stroke survivors in general, or just stroke survivors with aphasia?
I think that stroke survivors should consider it. Stroke survivors with aphasia should definitely consider it.
Yeah. Are you involved at all with the aphasia association or society, or have you shared your situation, your story with them?
I haven't, but I think that sounds like a marvelous idea.
Hey, man, we're just brainstorming here. This is Steve Heisler with the Injured Senior Podcast, and I am talking to Marcia Moran, stroke survivor and author of Stroke Forward, a great book which I read and learned a lot, really learned a lot. Marcia, now part of the title is that how to become your own healthcare advocate. What advice could you give to other stroke survivors or people who've just suffered health crises? What would you say to them about becoming their own healthcare advocate?
Well, in the beginning, I couldn't be my own healthcare advocate. It was my husband who was the advocate, and he didn't know what he was doing. Thus the book. But you have to see that you've got to have someone who's taking care of the patient, who understands what the patient wants and looks out for, it doesn't matter if it's maybe medicine or how they're treating the patient, or how, for example, my nurse took me to the bathroom and went out of the room to make the bed. And I had had a stroke. And so, of course, I fell down, crashed, because I had no muscles on my right-hand side. And she and my husband ran into the bathroom. And that's when he thought, oh my goodness, I'm the only one that will care for her, right?
Yeah.
So you have to have a caregiver in the beginning if you are not capable of having. For me, I had no message because I couldn't speak to anyone. So over time, though, you have to start taking it back. And for me, my husband went back to work in August of that year. And he said he would take me for a drive to see if I could drive myself, right? And so we got into the car, and it was a 1997 Miata. And I thought,
it's a nice
I'm
car.
not sure. That's a great car.
I love
right.
the Miatas.
I didn't know if I could shift into reverse, though. And I couldn't unless I used my left hand, which I did. And we got down the street, and I did manage to shift in all forward gears using my right hand. And he said, you can drive, but you can only drive 4 miles, and you cannot go on the highway. So I think about that as being the first day I started taking my independence back. And later, I decided if I didn't use a doctor, it was because of this particular thing, right? So I don't like this. I'm going to find someone else who will treat me better.
So, Marcia, you talk about obviously taking your healthcare situation into your own hands. One thing I noticed when I read the book, one thing that I was kind of struck by, was that Jim, your husband, but also your caregiver, was there from the beginning. What I got from it was that the most important thing was when the doctors were, first examining you and trying to come up with a diagnosis, there were so many questions, but there were a lot of things that they were saying to you, which you obviously were not in any position to comprehend, but Jim was there, and Jim was able to, be able to navigate doctor speak, as you call it. And I think that seemed like that was really helpful, for him to be there for you. Would you agree?
Yep, absolutely. So I count my blessings because he was always in my room during hospital hours, visiting hours, and he was always cheerful. I didn't know that when he left, he let his emotions show. So he wasn't cheerful when he left. He was actually pretty down the first few days, and he called my sister and asked her to come the first day, and she said she didn't know if she could make it that weekend because she's a CPA and it was tax season. When he called
she showed
her,
up.
She showed up, exactly. He called her the second night and he said, "Please, I'm afraid Marcia's going to die." And she showed up.
Yeah. Well, that's how dire the situation was. And then she was, I think, also, it was good to see your sister, but right away you started playing card games, and the card games helped you get better, right?
It did, yeah.
Well, that's great. That's great. So what are some resources that you could recommend for any of our listeners that might want to just be able to have information or tools or strategies as far as advocating for themselves in a healthcare situation, especially an emergency or a catastrophic situation?
Well, I have a bunch of resources available on my website. So that's strokeforward.com. And I would be pleased if they came and looked at them because they are so important. There's podcasts. There's a video of someone doing a TED Talk. There are books available. So there are a whole lot of resources for people.
Now, is that what you're doing now? I mean, I know you had a successful business. Are you still doing that business, or are you spending more of your time, going across the country, across the world, to educate people about how they can become their own healthcare advocate?
I am definitely doing Stroke Forward as a business now because not enough people are aware of what the symptoms are for people having a stroke. And there aren't enough people who understand what advocacy is. So I want to make sure that as many people as possible learn about it.
Sure. And if someone wants to get the book, how do they get the book?
They can go to Amazon and look for Stroke Forward.
Great. And I can, again, I'm not in any way associated with your book. I read it before the podcast, and really there was just it was a great story. It wasn't great what happened in the beginning, but it was great how it ended, or I guess it hasn't ended, but I got to where we are now. You're living the life just about the way you were living beforehand. So yeah, I mean, and it's a great book, and there's so many tips and little nuggets of advice that you give in each chapter. So I highly recommend it, and I definitely say that from the heart.
Thank you.
Can you tell our listeners, if they want to follow you on social media, what the social media platforms are that you are on?
Yes, so if you want to follow me on Facebook, it's Stroke Forward. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's stroke_forward. And on LinkedIn, it's Marcia Moran.
Great. Now, Marcia, before we go, do you have one last piece of advice or maybe some action steps, couple action steps that stroke survivors, individuals with aphasia, they might take to heart, or something that they could use to help their plight?
You know, it seems kind of silly to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Don't give up ever. You can get better as long as you think you can. So I'm at 95%, but I'm still striving to be 100%. So don't ever give up. And I think that strokes, the caregivers, they need to be sure to take care of themselves, because stroke is a long-term disability. And you have to be there for the long haul. So you have to make sure you exercise, you eat right, you get enough sleep. You have to take care of yourself in order to take care of your stroke survivor.
Well, that's good advice, because we have a lot of caregivers that listen, and a lot of times people don't appreciate what the caregivers go through. So I'm really glad that you shared that. And by the way, I'm hoping to meet you someday, Marcia, and I'm really looking forward to meeting Jim, because Jim sounds like a heck of a guy.
He is.
Tell him I said hello.
I will. Thank you.
All right. So it was nice to have you on the podcast today, Marcia. Keep fighting the good fight, and we'll check back in with you soon to see how you're doing, and maybe you can tell us some more stories about your fight for healthcare advocacy, and we'll be real interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much.
Injured senior and aging population, thanks for listening to today's episode. I want to again thank Marcia Moran for appearing on the show today. Really a gripping story, and so glad that she's really made it almost back to where she was beforehand. She says she's 95%, but she sounds like she's 100%. If you love this podcast, we would love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review on any of the podcast platforms that you listen to. If you want to share your story, such as Marcia just did today, feel free to email me at steve@injuredseniorhotline.com, or you can go onto our website at www.injuredseniorpodcast.com and leave a message. There's actually a little box on the homepage where you can just click it and you can leave a message, speak, and I will get back to you and try to answer your question and see if we can have you share on the podcast. Until next time, my good friends, so happy to have had you here today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. I am so looking forward to next week's show. Stay safe, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Injured Senior Podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate, subscribe, review, and share on Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with us at injuredseniorpodcast.com and sign up for our newsletter. To find out more or to get help at any time, visit injuredseniorpodcast.com or call 855-622-6530. That's 855-622-6530.